72-year-old Beatrice Caldwell was thrown into the freezing rain with nothing but a garbage bag of her clothes. Her greedy stepson seized the family mansion, leaving her a worthless, rocky wasteland. He thought he had destroyed her. He didn't know that barren dirt hid a forgotten, priceless underground gold vault. The rain falling on Oak Haven Cemetery felt like ice, but it was nothing compared to the chill radiating from Richard Caldwell. 72-year-old Beatrice stood a few paces away from the freshly dug grave of her late husband, Arthur. She pulled her black wool coat tighter around her fragile frame, her hands trembling. For 22 years, Beatrice had been the heart of the Caldwell home. She had loved Arthur deeply, nursing him through his final agonizing battle with dementia. She had also helped raise Richard since he was 10 years old, trying desperately to be a mother to a boy whose heart had seemingly been carved from granite. Richard did not look at her during the service. Dressed in a bespoke Italian suit that cost more than most people made in a month, he stared at his father's mahogany casket with a dry, calculating gaze. There were no tears from the 32-year-old heir. Only the barely concealed impatience of a man waiting to claim his throne. 2 days later, the true depth of Richard's cruelty was unveiled inside the sterile, wood-paneled office of Harrison Gable, the Caldwell family's long-time estate attorney. Beatrice sat in a high-backed leather chair, her hands clutching her purse. Beside her, Richard lounged with an air of absolute arrogance, checking his gold wristwatch. "Let's get this over with, Harrison," Richard snapped, not bothering to hide his disdain. "I have a board meeting at Caldwell Manufacturing in an hour. It's time the company had real leadership anyway." Mr. Gable cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He looked down at the last will and testament of Arthur Caldwell, a document that had been mysteriously updated only 3 weeks before Arthur's massive, fatal stroke, during a time when Arthur's mind was slipping and Richard had taken over his father's medical and legal affairs. "Very well," Mr. Gable said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "To my son, Richard Caldwell, I leave the entirety of my shares in Caldwell, manufacturing the primary estate located on Oak Grove Lane, and all liquid assets held in my personal and business accounts." Beatrice's breath hitched. That was everything. The multi-million-dollar company, the ancestral home she had restored with her own hands, the savings she and Arthur had shared. "And to my wife, Beatrice," the lawyer continued, refusing to meet her eyes, "I leave the deed to Tract 42, commonly known as the Miller's Folly Acreage, to do with as she sees fit." Silence fell over the room, thick and suffocating. Beatrice stared at the attorney, her mind racing. "Tract 42, she whispered. "Harrison, that's just the old barren field out past the county line. It's 12 acres of rocks and dead soil. Arthur bought it 30 years ago as a tax write-off. There's nothing there but an abandoned hunting cabin. That is what the document states." "Mrs. Caldwell," Gable replied, stiffly sliding the paperwork toward her. "But Arthur promised," Beatrice said, her voice finally breaking. "He promised I would have the house. He promised I would be taken care of. He was barely lucid when this was signed." "Are you accusing me of something, Beatrice?" Richard sneered, dragging out her name like a curse. He leaned forward, dropping the facade of the grieving son entirely. "My father finally saw reason at the end. You were nothing but a gold digger who swooped in when my mother died. You spent 20 years living in luxury on the Caldwell dime. Now the ride is over." "I raised you, Richard," she whispered, tears finally spilling over her wrinkled cheeks. "I loved your father, and I tried to love you. Save the soap opera for someone who cares." Richard laughed, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket. "The will is ironclad. My lawyers made sure of it. You have exactly 2 hours to get your personal belongings out of my house. If you're not gone by noon, I'll have security drag you out." Beatrice felt the world tilt on its axis. She was 72 years old, suffering from mild arthritis, and had just buried the love of her life. Now she was being thrown onto the street. When she arrived back at the Oak Grove mansion, Richard had already moved with ruthless efficiency. 2 burly private security guards stood on the grand wraparound porch. On the driveway, sitting in the freezing drizzle, were 3 black heavy-duty trash bags. "What is this?" Beatrice gasped, stepping out of her beat-up 1998 Volvo station wagon. "Mr. Caldwell's orders," one of the guards said, crossing his arms. "He had the maids pack your clothes. You are no longer permitted on the premises." "My photo albums," Beatrice cried, trying to push past the guard. "Arthur's letters, my mother's china." The guard shoved her back hard enough that she stumbled and fell onto the wet, unyielding concrete of the driveway. Pain shot through her hip, but the physical ache was drowned out by the agonizing heartbreak. She looked up at the towering windows of the master bedroom. There, standing behind the glass, was Richard. He looked down at her, shivering in the rain, raised a crystal glass of scotch in a mocking toast, and let the heavy velvet curtains fall shut. Shivering, soaked to the bone, and entirely alone in the world, Beatrice picked herself up. She loaded the 3 trash bags into the back of her old Volvo. She had no money, no family, and nowhere to go. Nowhere except Tract 42. The barren wasteland that was now her entire worldly inheritance. The drive to Tract 42 took nearly an hour, winding deep into the neglected rural outskirts of Oakhaven. The paved roads gave way to gravel, and the gravel gave way to rutted, muddy dirt trails. When Beatrice finally pulled her sputtering Volvo to a halt, the reality of her situation settled heavily upon her chest. Before her lay 12 acres of absolute desolation. The locals hadn't called it Miller's Folly for nothing. The land was a jagged expanse of limestone, dead weeds and grey, unyielding dirt. No crops could grow here. No developer would ever build here. In the centre of the wasteland sat a dilapidated wooden structure that barely qualified as a cabin. The roof was sagging, the porch steps had rotted through, and the windows were caked with decades of grime. Beatrice stepped out of the car, the biting wind whipping her silver hair around her face. She walked up to the cabin, broke the rusted padlock with a heavy stone, and pushed the door open. The smell of mildew animal droppings and stagnant air washed over her. There was no electricity, no running water, only a crude, wood-burning stove in the corner and a rusty iron bed frame. She sank onto the dusty floor, buried her face in her hands, and finally let out the agonizing, guttural sobs she had been holding back. She wept for Arthur. She wept for the betrayal of the boy she had tried to mother. And she wept for herself, an old woman left to die in the dirt. But Beatrice Caldwell was not a woman who surrendered easily. She had grown up poor before meeting Arthur, and beneath her gentle exterior was a spine of pure steel. As the evening shadows lengthened, she wiped her tears. "Crying won't keep you warm, Bay," she muttered to herself. The first month was a brutal test of survival. Beatrice lived like a pioneer. She chopped dry brush for the stove, hauled water from a nearby creek, and survived on canned beans and rice she bought with the last few dollars in her purse. The winter cold seeped into her bones, making her joints ache terribly, but she forced herself to keep moving. Her only saving grace was an elderly neighboring farmer named Thomas Higgins, whose property bordered the far edge of the barren field. Thomas, a gruff but kind widower, noticed the smoke rising from the abandoned cabin and drove his tractor over to investigate. Appalled by her living conditions, Thomas began bringing her firewood warm soup and a kerosene heater. "You can't stay out here, Mrs. Caldwell." Thomas warned one bitterly cold January morning, pouring her a cup of coffee from his thermos. "This land is cursed. It's nothing but bedrock and misery. Richard Caldwell is a monster for doing this to you. Let me call the county, get you into a subsidized apartment." "No, Thomas," Beatrice said firmly, wrapping her calloused hands around the warm mug. "This is my land. It's all I have left of Arthur. I'm not leaving." During those long, silent winter nights, Beatrice kept her sanity by looking at the few keepsakes the maids had hastily thrown into the trash bags. Among them was a heavy ornate silver locket Arthur had given her on their 10th anniversary. It was an unusual piece of jewelry, thick, clunky, and locked with a tiny clasp. Sitting by the fire one night, Beatrice remembered Arthur's final days. After his stroke, he had lost the ability to speak, but she vividly recalled him, lying in his hospital bed, frantically tapping his chest where the locket used to rest, and then pointing a trembling, desperate finger toward a framed map of Oakhaven County on his hospital room wall. Specifically, he had pointed to the outskirts, to Tract 42. Why, she wondered, tracing the cool silver of the locket. Arthur was a brilliant businessman. Why had he kept this useless, barren plot of land for 30 years, paying taxes on it annually without ever visiting it? When the brutal winter finally broke, giving way to the muddy thaw of April, Beatrice decided she needed to do something with the land to sustain herself. If she could clear even a small patch of rocks near the cabin, she could plant a vegetable garden. She borrowed a heavy iron pickaxe from Thomas and went to work. It was back-breaking labor. Every swing sent shock waves up her arms, jarring her arthritic shoulders. For 3 days, she cleared loose stones and dead roots, fighting for every inch of soil. On the 4th day, near a subtle depression in the earth that was usually hidden by tall, dead thistle, Beatrice swung the pickaxe down with all her might. Instead of the dull thud of dirt or the sharp crack of limestone, a loud metallic clang echoed across the desolate field. The vibration was so intense it knocked the pickaxe from her hands. Beatrice froze her breath, coming in heavy gasps. She dropped to her knees in the mud and began scraping away the thick, wet soil with her bare hands. Her fingernails caked with dirt and bled, but she didn't stop. 10 inches below the surface, she uncovered it. It wasn't a pipe. It wasn't an old tractor part. It was a massive, perfectly square plate of heavy reinforced steel. Heart pounding wildly against her ribs, Beatrice grabbed a hand shovel and frantically cleared the perimeter. The steel plate was roughly 4 feet by 4 feet. In the center of the heavy metal hatch was a thick, circular wheel, heavily oxidized but intact. And right in the middle of that wheel was a very distinct, unusually deep keyhole. Beatrice stared at the keyhole. It was an antique mechanism far too complex for a simple bunker. She sat back in the mud, her mind racing back to the hospital room, to Arthur tapping his chest. With trembling hands, she reached into her shirt and pulled out the heavy silver locket. She fumbled with the tiny clasp, popping it open. She had always thought the inside contained a decorative piece of molded metal fused to the silver. But as she pried at it with her dirt-stained thumb, the metal piece clicked and slid free. It wasn't a decoration. It was a heavy, intricately cut steel key. Beatrice crawled back to the hatch. She blew the decades of dust and debris out of the keyhole. Taking a deep breath, she inserted the key. It fit perfectly. With a hard twist of her wrist, she turned it. A loud, heavy mechanical thunk resonated from deep beneath the earth, shaking the ground beneath her knees. The barren field had just unlocked its secret. Beatrice's heart hammered against her ribs, echoing like a war drum in the desolate silence of Tract 42. The mechanical thunk that vibrated through the earth was profound, a sound of heavy machinery waking from a decades-long slumber. She gripped the rusted steel wheel with both hands, her arthritic joints protesting with flares of hot pain. She planted her muddy boots against the cold steel plate for leverage and pulled. At first it refused to yield. By a sudden fierce surge of adrenaline. She thought of Arthur's desperate trembling finger pointing at the map in his sterile hospital room. She thought of Richard's cruel, mocking smile as he watched her being thrown into the freezing rain. With a guttural cry that tore from her throat, she threw her entire meager weight backward. With a screech of agonizing metal against metal, the wheel turned a full quarter rotation. A hiss of stale, compressed air escaped from the seal. The heavy steel hatch, counterweighted by concealed massive industrial hinges, suddenly popped upward. Beatrice scrambled backward, gasping for breath, as the hatch swung open, revealing a gaping, rectangular black hole in the earth. The smell that wafted up was not the scent of dirt or decay, but the distinct dry odor of poured concrete and machine oil. She crawled to the edge and peered down. A set of sturdy steel stairs descended into the absolute pitch-black darkness. "Thomas!" Beatrice whispered into the wind. She needed help. Leaving the hatch open to air out, she practically ran back to her beat-up Volvo. She drove the rutted dirt path to Thomas Higgins' neighboring farm, her hands shaking violently on the steering wheel. When she found the gruff farmer fixing a tractor in his barn, she dragged him back to Tract 42 without a word of explanation. When Thomas saw the open hatch, his jaw dropped. "Good Lord, Beatrice," he breathed, shining his heavy-duty yellow flashlight down the stairwell. "I've lived next to this wasteland for 40 years. I never knew this was here. Arthur put it here." Beatrice said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Let's go down." Thomas led the way, his flashlight beam slicing through the impenetrable gloom. The stairs ended 20 feet below the surface, opening into a massive climate-controlled bunker lined with reinforced concrete walls. As Thomas swept the beam across the room, the light caught a row of heavy green metal industrial shelving units stretching across the back wall. On those shelves sat dozens of heavy wooden crates, meticulously stacked and banded with thick iron straps. In the center of the room sat a simple metal desk. On it lay a single leather-bound ledger, a Mont Blanc fountain pen, and a sealed envelope, with Beatrice written on it in Arthur's elegant, sweeping handwriting. Beatrice rushed to the desk. Her hands shook violently as she tore open the envelope. Inside was a letter dated 3 years prior. "My dearest Beatrice, if you are reading this, my mind has failed me and I am gone. I am also deeply sorry for it. Means Richard has likely shown his true colors and driven you here. For years I watched my son become a man consumed by unparalleled greed. 3 years ago, I discovered Richard was quietly embezzling millions from Caldwell Manufacturing, siphoning the company's lifeblood into offshore accounts. He thought I was too old and foolish to notice. I knew that if I confronted him directly, his corporate lawyers would tie the estate in litigation for decades, and you would be left destitute. So I played the fool. I quietly liquidated my personal founder, shares, our private wealth accounts at JP Morgan Chase, and every hidden asset I possessed. I converted it all to untraceable physical assets. I left Richard the company knowing it is hollowed out by his own theft, a rotting shell waiting to collapse. But the true wealth of the Caldwell legacy, everything I wanted you to have, is in this room. The deed to this barren land is your impenetrable shield. I love you, Beatrice. Now live the life you deserve." Tears streamed down Beatrice's cheeks, dropping onto the dusty concrete floor. Arthur had not abandoned her. He had sacrificed his own company to protect her. "Beatrice," Thomas choked out. He had walked over to the nearest wooden crate. He used a heavy flathead screwdriver from his overalls to pry up the lid, snapping the rusted iron band. He shone the flashlight inside. The beam reflected off a blinding, brilliant, mesmerizing yellow glow. The crate was packed tightly, with row upon row of pure solid gold bars. Beatrice walked over her breath, catching in her throat. She reached down and picked one up. It was astonishingly heavy cold to the touch and stamped with the unmistakable insignia of the Credit Suisse refinery. "There are 40 crates here. B." Thomas whispered, his voice trembling with absolute shock. "Each one holds dozens of bars. At today's market value, this isn't just a fortune. It's tens of millions of dollars. You are sitting on a sovereign treasury." Beatrice held the gold bar, the weight of it grounding her. The grief that had consumed her for months began to recede, replaced by a cold, brilliant clarity. She wiped her tears away with the back of her dirt-caked hand. "Thomas," Beatrice said, her voice steady and hard. "I need you to drive me to town. We need to make a phone call to the federal authorities. And then we wait." While Beatrice and Thomas were deep underground, 30 miles away, in the towering glass skyscraper of Caldwell Manufacturing, Richard Caldwell was hurling a crystal Scotch decanter against the wall of his father's former office. The glass shattered, raining expensive liquor over the plush carpet. "What do you mean the accounts are empty?" Richard screamed, his face flushed a violent crimson. Across the mahogany desk, a terrified forensic accountant from the prestigious firm PricewaterhouseCoopers adjusted his collar. "Mr. Caldwell, I've audited the private wealth ledgers as you requested. The capital didn't vanish recently. Over the last 3 years, your father systematically liquidated over $60 million in assets. The money was wired through dummy corporations and then used to purchase physical bullion. It was completely removed from the corporate ecosystem." "Where is it?" Richard demanded, leaning over the desk like a rabid dog. "My father was a senile old fool. He didn't just burn $60 million. Where did he hide it?" We don't know," the accountant stammered. "The only anomaly is a series of massive freight deliveries made to an unzoned rural property owned by the estate. Tract 42, commonly known as Miller's Folly." Richard froze. The blood drained from his face. Tract 42, the worthless, barren wasteland he had happily signed over to his despised stepmother just to get rid of her. "Get my security team." Richard growled, his eyes burning with absolute murderous fury. "Get them right now." The morning sun cast long, dramatic shadows across the barren landscape of Tract 42. Beatrice sat calmly on the rickety wooden porch of the dilapidated cabin. She wore her tattered wool coat, a steaming cup of tea resting in her hands. Beside her stood Thomas, holding a worn, double-barreled shotgun resting casually over his forearm. In the distance, the roar of heavy engines shattered the quiet, rural morning. A convoy of 3 black, armored luxury SUVs tore down the rutted gravel road, kicking up massive plumes of grey dust. The vehicles skidded to a violent halt just yards from the cabin. The doors flew open, and 6 burly private security contractors stepped out, their hands resting menacingly on the tactical belts at their waists. Finally, the door of the lead SUV opened, and Richard Caldwell stepped out. He was dressed in his signature custom suit, but his usual polished arrogance was entirely gone, replaced by a desperate, manic frenzy. Richard took one look at the heavy steel hatch protruding from the dirt behind the cabin, which Beatrice had deliberately left wide open. He let out a breathless, triumphant laugh. "You old witch!" Richard spat, marching toward the porch. "You found it. You actually found my money." "It is not your money, Richard," Beatrice said, taking a slow sip of her tea. Her voice was remarkably calm, carrying across the cold wind. "Your father left me the deed to this land, and everything upon it and beneath it. You made absolutely sure that the will was ironclad. Remember, your lawyers guaranteed it." Richard's face twisted into a snarl. "Do you think I care about a piece of paper? That gold was bought with Caldwell manufacturing assets that belong to me. You manipulated a dying, senile man into hiding my inheritance." "He hid it," Beatrice corrected gently, "because he knew you were stealing from the company. He knew you were embezzling Richard. He left the ledger." Richard paused, a flicker of genuine panic crossing his eyes. But he quickly recovered, waving a dismissive hand at his security team. "It doesn't matter what you found. You're an old, frail woman sitting in the middle of nowhere. My men are going down into that bunker, and we are taking every single crate. If you or this dirt-farming neighbor of yours try to stop us, things will get very unfortunate for you." "You are trespassing on private property, boy," Thomas warned, racking the shotgun with a loud, intimidating clack. Richard laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Shoot me, old man. See what happens. Boys, get into the vault. Secure the gold." The security contractors moved forward, unholstering heavy stun batons. Beatrice didn't flinch. She simply set her teacup down on the rotting wooden railing. Suddenly, the distinct, rhythmic chopping sound of heavy rotor blades echoed from the sky. Richard looked up, squinting against the morning sun. Cresting over the tree line to the east were two dark helicopters moving incredibly fast. At the exact same moment, the sound of wailing sirens erupted from the main road. A fleet of unmarked black sedans and several Oakhaven County Sheriff's cruisers came barreling down the dirt path, completely blocking off Richard's SUVs. Dust swirled furiously into the air as the vehicles slammed on their brakes, effectively trapping Richard and his men. Dozens of armed federal agents wearing jackets emblazoned with FBI swarmed out of the vehicles, raising their weapons. "Federal agents, drop your weapons. Hands in the air," a commanding voice echoed through a bullhorn. Richard's security team, realizing instantly they were outmatched and outgunned by the federal government, immediately dropped their batons and raised their hands, surrendering without a fight. Richard stood frozen in absolute disbelief as an FBI special agent in charge marched up to him, accompanied by Harrison Gable, the Caldwell estate attorney, who looked incredibly pale and nervous. "Richard Caldwell." The lead agent barked, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "You are under arrest for massive corporate fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion, and grand larceny." "You can't do this," Richard screamed, his voice cracking with panic as the agent violently wrenched his arms behind his back, securing the cuffs tightly. "She stole my money. That gold belongs to me. Look in the vault." "We already know about the vault, Mr. Caldwell," the agent replied coldly. "Mrs. Caldwell's legal counsel contacted us early this morning. We have reviewed the sworn statement and the photographic evidence of Arthur Caldwell's secret ledger. The ledger meticulously details over $20 million you systematically siphoned into illegal shell accounts in the Cayman Islands. As for the gold in the vault, Arthur purchased it legally, using his own liquidated post-tax founder shares through a private broker at J.P. Morgan Chase. He deeded the land to Beatrice, making her the sole undisputed legal owner of all mineral and physical assets on the property." Richard's knees buckled. The absolute reality of his destruction crashed down upon him. He had signed away his own salvation. In his greed to secure the corporate empire and evict his stepmother, he had legally cemented her ownership of a $60 million fortune, while leaving himself holding a hollowed-out company that would now be seized by the federal government. "Beatrice." Richard wailed, dropping his arrogant facade entirely. He was suddenly a pathetic, terrified little boy, begging for mercy. "Beatrice, please, I'm your son. You raised me. Don't let them do this." Beatrice stood up from her rocking chair. She walked slowly down the rotting wooden steps, leaning heavily on the wooden railing. She walked right up to Richard, looking him dead in the eyes. "You threw me out into the freezing rain with garbage bags, Richard," she said, her voice soft, but echoing with absolute authority. "You laughed while I shivered on the pavement. I loved your father, and I tried to love you, but you chose your path. Now the ride is over." She turned her back on him, walking over to Thomas. She didn't look back as the FBI agents shoved a sobbing, thrashing Richard into the back of a federal cruiser. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing his fate forever. 6 months later, the landscape of Oak Haven had fundamentally changed. The Caldwell Manufacturing Company was liquidated to pay off the massive debts Richard had incurred, though the estate itself was salvaged. Beatrice Caldwell returned to the grand mansion on Oak Grove Lane, not as an evicted widow, but as the sole owner. She had contracted Sotheby's private brokerage to quietly liquidate half of the gold bullion, securing a fortune that ensured she would live in absolute comfort for the rest of her days. She established the Arthur Caldwell Foundation, pouring millions into dementia research and rural community development, honoring her husband's true legacy. As for Tract 42, Beatrice refused to sell it. She hired a premier construction firm to completely renovate the underground bunker, turning it into a secure state-of-the-art storage facility. But above ground, she kept it exactly the same. On a warm summer afternoon, Beatrice stood on the newly rebuilt porch of the cabin, looking out over the barren, rocky dirt. Thomas Higgins sat beside her, sipping a cold glass of lemonade. "You know," Thomas chuckled, looking at the desolate landscape. "Folks in town still call this place Miller's Folly. They think you're crazy for coming out here." Beatrice smiled, reaching up to touch the heavy silver locket resting over her heart. The key was safely locked away, its purpose fulfilled. "Let them think what they want, Thomas," Beatrice said softly, the afternoon sun catching the silver of her locket. "Sometimes the most beautiful things in the world are hidden beneath the ugliest dirt. You just have to know where to dig." If you are absolutely captivated by Beatrice's incredible discovery and want to see the shocking moment she opens the vault and faces her cruel stepson's ultimate downfall, hit that like button. Right now, don't forget to share this story with someone who loves a brilliant tale of karma, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a twist. Drop a comment below on what you think is hiding inside that vault.